Hi everyone, welcome to part 4 looking at functioning ecosystems. Last lesson we went through these ideas of production efficiency, and we also considered the cycling of different matter such as water, nitrogen and carbon as it cycles through the different ecosystems. This lesson, our learning goals are to 1. Define ecological niche in terms of habitat, feeding relationships and interactions with other species. 2. Understand the competitive exclusion principle. And 3. Analyze data to identify species, including microorganisms or populations occupying an ecological niche. So let's get into it. It is another big one. Hopefully a lot of these terms will make sense to you. Now, there are a couple of definitions I would say highlight, read out to yourself night and night, because the syllabus has specifically said use the definition we have given you. And the fact that they're saying use the definition we have given you means it's probably more likely to come up on an external exam, given the fact that they know everyone will have used this exact definition. So here it is. This is the first one here, ecological niche. So an ecological niche is the role and space that an organism fills in an ecosystem, including all its interactions with the biotic and abiotic factors of its environment. Now, that might not mean a whole lot now, but it is something that you're going to say over and over again till you can do it. So let's break this down. An ecological niche is role and space that an organism fills in an ecosystem. When I use this term role, think about how it fits in, and we'll look at that a bit later on the next slide. But the role is kind of what it is doing. And the space, well, that's kind of looking at the environment, the habitat that it's able to occupy within that particular ecosystem. So it does include all of its interactions with the biotics, so the living components, so the butterflies, the trees, the different food, and the abiotic factors. In this case, we've got a rock, okay, and all of the other things in that environment that are non-living. So a niche encompasses basically everything about that organism. It's kind of the definition that goes, you want to know about this organism? Well, that's its niche, okay? Its ecological niche is how it interacts with all the living and all the non-living parts of an ecosystem. So to try and help you understand this a bit more, they kind of say if an organism's habitat is its address, the niche is the organism's profession. Now, an organism's niche is its ecological role, or how it fits into an ecosystem. So how does this organism actually fit in this particular ecosystem that it lives? Now, using the idea of profession, I'm a teacher. Now, I teach biology and science. That is my niche. When I go to school, what is my role? Well, I'm teaching science, I'm teaching biology, I'm interacting with the classroom, that environment, the students, all of those things. So the abiotic and biotic parts of that particular ecosystem if we looked at the school. That is my particular niche. Now, other teachers within that ecosystem have different niches. They have different classrooms. They have different specialties. They interact with different non-living components and living components in their ecosystem. So that is its niche. Think about its role and the space that an organism fills and all of its interactions with the biotic and abiotic components of its actual ecosystem. So it's kind of like this broad definition that if you want to go, I want to know everything about an organism. Well, that's its ecological niche, where it's living, who it's interacting with, all of those different things there. Hopefully that is clear to you in I guess, an initial stage what a niche is. So to look at an example, so we've got a saddleback tamarin monkey of the Amazonian rainforest and an emperor tamarin monkey also living in that rainforest. So it lives in this same ecosystem, but its role and what it does is a bit different. So the saddleback, they're diurnal, so they're active during the day. Arboreal, they live in trees, they feed on fruits and insects from trees, the trunk of trees up to 10 meters above ground, live in groups of 2 to 12 individuals, and usually give birth to twins during times of food abundance after a gestation of 155 days. Now, that's not everything about that organism, but that kind of is its niche. So how it interacts with the abiotic component, how it's interacting with the biotic, its role, and the different interactions it has. You compare that to the emperor tamarin monkey that occupies a different niche. So here, yes, this is the same. So they're diurnal and arboreal, so they're active during the day and they live in trees. They feed on fruit and insects, green leafy plants, eggs and tree saps from trees 10 to 30 meters. And this is a big key thing. Look at this, up to the height 10 meters above ground level. So if we looked at this rainforest and we've got some trees, well, this one's living here, so the saddleback, is living in the first 10 meters, and then here this tamarin is now living in 10 to 30. So it is occupying a different niche. Consider it as it's occupying a different classroom. If we're looking at teachers, I'm in the science, it might be a drama teacher in the drama building, okay? So it occupies a different niche even though it's in the same ecosystem. They live in groups of 2 to 8, so some slight difference. Dominant females usually give birth to twins, again during abundance, 144 days gestation, some slight differences there. But you can see, and this is the point that I'm trying to make, although they live in the same range, the two species of tamarin monkeys exhibit different ways of life and therefore occupy their own individual niches, okay? So their role, how they fit into that environment, is actually different despite living in the same ecosystem. They have different niches. How they fit in is different. When we talk about niches, we break them down into 2 different types of niches. So the first one is an organism's fundamental niche. So write down this definition. And this is the widest possible niche that a species could ideally occupy without competitors, predators, or parasites. So without any of those other species interactions, where could this organism live? So here, if we look at the Thamylus barnacle, which is in this low tide zone into the high tide zone, we can see that it can actually occupy all of that. It's able to survive the abiotic factors all the way down from the low tide zone all the way up to the high tide zone. So the Thamylus barnacle can potentially occupy the entire rocky shore if it's in isolation. That's its fundamental niche, its widest possible area that it could actually live. So as a teacher, potentially I could teach anything. If there was no one else at the school, I rock up, I'm the only one there, potentially I could go in like a sub and teach anything on the day I was given. That's my fundamental niche. Just like this barnacle, it's the widest possible area that I can actually to live based on the other conditions. Now, if all of a sudden we add other organisms, this is when we talk about the organism's realized niche. So write this definition down as well. An organism's realized niche is the actual niche that the species occupies given the restrictions placed on it by interactions with other species. So here we've got the semi-ballinus barnacle, and it comes in, and you can see that it is a better competitor. And here you've got the Thamylus barnacle, and it's only occupying areas where this other semi-ballinus barnacle is absent. So because this one outcompetes this, even though it can potentially live all the way down here, it has a realized niche, which is here. Where this one, its fundamental niche, well, because it's a great competitor, it's able to live all throughout this area here. Hopefully that makes sense, that the fundamental niche is the largest possible range without any of those other species interactions an organism can live. However, its realized niche is actually where it occupies when we consider the fact that it is going to have other organisms to compete with and have to live with there. So we refer to this as its realized niche because we've got these limiting factors for it, and we've looked at what limiting factors are previously, put upon it by the competition with other organisms. In this case, this other species of barnacle in that tidal zone. So competition will increase as a population grows, and this is due to mainly the depletion of food sources. So understand this idea. Competition increases as population grows due to mainly the depletion of food sources being the big one. And therefore, competition is what we refer to as a density dependent factor. I'm going to look at density dependent, and there's another one. If we've got dependent, we've got one that's independent factors when we look at population ecology in greater detail. But for now, understand that a density dependent factor is a factor that affects population growth as the numbers of individuals increase. So it's density dependent because as the number of individuals increase or the number of individuals decrease, the population growth is affected. So how many organisms can live and where they're distributed, the abundance and distribution in a way is affected. So density dependent factors like competition depend on how large the actual population is. The larger the population, more competition. The smaller the population, less competition that organism is going to experience. So when we consider competition, competition does affect the size of the competitor's realized niche. And the effect is dependent on the intensity and type of competition. So in certain types of competition, you are going to be able to live in a wider realized niche, and other ones you're going to live in a more narrow niche. So if we look here, niches are narrower with moderate interspecific competition. So you can see here, competition with other organisms causes this niche to be narrower than, I guess, its fundamental niche, which is where it could live if it didn't have any competition. So here we've got intense interspecific competition, so greater competition between individuals in figure 2, and that causes this niche to become narrower. And then if you get, in some cases, intense intraspecific competition, you get what we call a broader niche. So this one is interspecific, so to write this down, interspecific, so this is between different populations. It causes the realized niche to become narrower. If you get really intense interspecific competition, well, you're going to get an even narrower niche. However, if you get intense intraspecific competition, you get a broader niche, okay? And this is because individuals are forced to use resources at the more extremes of their habitat because they're not able to live or happily within a narrower realized niche simply because they have to try and spread out to be able to access those resources that they require. So intense intraspecific competition results in the broader niche, while intense interspecific competition results in a narrower niche. Either way, competition does affect population size, and competition does affect the role and where the space an organism will actually be able to occupy in the ecosystem. So strong competition can lead to the local elimination of one of the two competing species, and we call this process competitive exclusion. Basically, as the name suggests, where competition excludes one of those populations locally from that particular area or that particular niche. So the competitive exclusion principle states, write this definition down, that two species with exactly the same niche, so the role and space that they occupy, cannot coexist because they would compete for the same resources and one would exclude the other. So that's the whole idea of the competitive exclusion principle. So looking at this, when grown alone under a particular set of environmental conditions, two similar paramecium species thrive. So they're able to thrive larger numbers. However, when both species are grown together, because their niches overlap, so their role and space, they compete and the two outcomes become possible. So one is what we refer to as this competitive exclusion, where one species within the niche utilizes the resources more effectively, and this drives the local extinction of the other organism. Sometimes though, what we get is resource partitioning, and this is still competitive exclusion in a way, but instead of the local sort of elimination, it's still local extinction, I should say. What happens is these resources are partitioned, so the species each alter their use of the niche, dividing the resources. So they're living together, however they're not occupying the same niche. This one occupies this niche here, this one occupies this niche here. So it's called resource partitioning. So they're the two things that can happen when two organisms actually occupy the same niche. And this just shows you this in that same way. When they are grown separately, there is no niche overlap and both of them thrive. When they are grown together, we can get competitive exclusion occurring where one is locally extinct from it, or we can get resource partitioning where they alter their use of the niche and they divide the resources between each other. So we're going to look at those ideas in a bit of detail, looking at some data so you get this. And if you can see this experiment 1, okay, so the semi-balanus removal, and this is the semi-balanus present. And this is looking obviously at that thalamus cover of that particular barnacle. So the removal of the semi-balanus barnacles results in an increase in the thalamus barnacle coverage, hence the semi-balanus, I hate these names, affects the other barnacle's survival. Let's just go with that. So you notice when I look at this data, when this barnacle, the semi-balanus barnacle, is present, you get an increase initially, but then as the barnacle begins to outcompete, you see the gradual decrease in the population until it reaches a point where it is competitively excluded from that ecosystem there. Here, when we remove the barnacle, well, you get an increase in that population, and then it continues to increase as it's able to occupy its niche that it needs there because it's not being competitively excluded. When we do the experiment 2, okay, so this is now looking at the thalamus barnacle removal. So this is it present, this is its removed, and this is the amount of the semi-balanus coverage. So you can see here that the thalamus barnacle really does impact on this population, where when we remove this other barnacle, so the blue one, I should say when we remove the brown one, so we're left with the blue one, if you can remember that diagram, it doesn't drastically impact upon the niche, and they use this word, significantly alter the semi-balanus barnacle coverage, and therefore it does not affect its survival. So you can see here that this one here, the semi-balanus barnacle, really does impact the thalamus barnacle's growth and niche, where here it doesn't the other way around. So this one here is obviously the better competitor of the two, and it outcompetes the other barnacle, which is the idea. So you can see that even a slight reproductive advantage will eventually lead to the local elimination of the inferior competitor. And it doesn't have to be a huge reproductive advantage, but if one can reproduce and produce more organisms faster than the other and have a greater survival rate, well then as a result they'll eventually over time outcompete that other individual. And that data kind of shows that idea. Let's have a go at practicing using some data. Here is a question for you. So the two species of paramecium were grown in culture separately and together in mixed culture. The abundance of each species over time is shown in the figure below. Now, I reckon this would be sort of a great idea for external exam when we look at competitive exclusion using these paramecium, quite a common thing that's explored. So describe how these data provide evidence for competitive exclusion. I'm going to give this 3 marks. Have a go at working through an answer for yourself. Pause it, I'll go through an answer with you in a second. Then looking at the answer, describe how these data provide evidence for competitive exclusion. So carrying capacity is reached when both paramecium were grown independently. Now carrying capacity is the maximum capacity that a population can exist given all other limiting factors. So when they are grown independently, so separately, you can see that these populations reach a high level and begin to level off. Okay, so this is when that population is starting to steady. So we can see that it's reached what we refer to as its carrying capacity. And you notice that its numbers are much higher than when in mixed population. Here, you'll also notice in a mixed culture, the population of this paramecium aurelia increases as the population of chordatum decreases. And that's another thing. So I'm going to give you 1 mark here for identifying when grown separately, they both level out or reach a maximum capacity. If you don't use that word carrying capacity at this stage, that's okay. Eventually, I'd like you to be able to understand those terms, but we do look at that more in population ecology. Then 1 mark for identifying that in a mixed culture, the population of paramecium aurelia increase as population of paramecium chordatum decrease. So you get that idea. And this led to the local extinction of paramecium chordatum, providing evidence for competitive exclusion. And I give you 1 mark for actually answering that question, because you can notice here that you're getting the local extinction of one population while the other population is reaching a carrying capacity. However, it is a lower carrying capacity than when it is grown separately. So that does therefore indicate that the presence of this other paramecium does impact on the population growth of this other paramecium. However, when we look at competitive exclusion, we can see that this one must have a slight reproductive advantage. And it isn't noticed initially, but you see over time those results begin to become apparent that this one clearly has a slight reproductive advantage and therefore excludes competitively the other organism there. The other thing we looked at was resource partitioning. And this is the creative use of space and time that reduces competition between species and allows many new, unique ecological niches to exist in the same area. Consider this sunny, shady, moist, dry forest which contains different areas, and you can notice the different species of lizards that exist. Now, this lizard, as a result of years of competition, it has now has this realized leash in the real sunny, dry environment, growing on what I guess is imagining to represent cactuses. Then you have this lizard, which occupies its own niche more in the sunny, dry environment. As you move into the shady, moist, you can see that they partition resources by obviously being in different particular strata within that forest. So they're partitioning that resource. Now we've got these two, which are living on the same part of this environment. So how would they partition resources? Well, they might eat different things, and that's how they may be able to exist in a similar niche, because, well, it won't be similar because they'll eat different things, but exist in a similar area, I should say, because they may eat different things or different food, and as a result, that reduces the competition between them. Now, hopefully you can see that this idea of resource partitioning is the creative use of space, which reduces competition by either occupying a different area or space or a different role, so that you therefore have a unique niche to each individual organism. So each individual lizard has their own unique niche or role in that particular space. The other type of idea that can happen is character displacement, and this is what we call the evolutionary divergence, i.e. the movement in different directions. When we diverge, we go in different directions of characteristics displayed by two or more species with the same niche in a particular habitat. So when one or both species of competing organisms basically evolve to reduce the amount of overlap in their characteristic. So let's have a look at these birds in Santa Maria in San Cristobal. So percentage of individuals in each size classes. When you look here, when they are in individual populations, you can see that this bird has this particular size beak and beak depth, okay? And you can see that this one has this particular beak depth. And if you notice at this stage, they are very similar, okay, in their beak depth. So very similar. However, when they are together in Santa Maria, San Cristobal, their beak depth significantly differs. So as a result, their character has displaced over time to reduce the competition. And by having different beak depth, what it means is they're going to feed on different types of food, and therefore both can exist in the same area because they now occupy a different or their own unique ecological niche in that particular area of San Cristobal. And that's another thing that can happen. So this is basically the character displacement. So again, it would be sort of that idea of resource partitioning, because they're now going to eat different things as a result of that, but their character has actually displaced or changed to be able to suit or meet the requirements of that area to reduce competition. If you have a look at another question just to drive this home, so we've got this forest, we're looking at birds, similar ideas to what we've considered. So one, determine how the insectivorous birds in the secondary tree layer of the forest avoid direct competition for the same resources, and then two, explain why both the yellow-throated scrub wren and the ground thrush species are able to inhabit the ground layer in the eucalypt forest. Both, well, one's worth 2, one's worth 3 marks. Pause the video, have a go, we'll look at some answers now. Looking at this one, we've got the brown thornbill, finding it here. So we've got the brown thornbill, the white-throated tree creeper, and the rufous fantail. So how can they avoid direct competition? They live in the same forest. What they are doing is they avoid direct competition for insects by gathering their food at different locations. Giving you 1 mark for acknowledging that. So the white-throated tree creeper, it's gathering its food from the canopy, and it's actually extracting it from the bark. But the key idea is it is getting it from the canopy. So this is its niche, its space, and it is extracting insects from the bark, where the brown thornbill is gleaning from foliage, but this is in the secondary tree layer. The rufous fantail also exists in the secondary tree layer, but it is catching insects in flight. So this one's eating them on the foliage, this one's eating them in flight, and as a result of that, they occupy different niches, different roles. One gets it from the foliage, one gets it from the flight, one gets it from a different area completely. So a different space, a different niche. So you get 1 mark for acknowledging they gather it from different locations, and then you get 1 mark for telling me exactly where or giving your evidence for that. So 1 for different locations, 1 for providing the evidence of how they avoid that by getting those insects from different locations. Hopefully you can understand that idea that each of those birds are able to live in that same environment because they now occupy their own unique ecological niche. And they do that by living in different parts and different areas, but also their role that they play is different because one is gleaning insects from foliage, one is catching insects in flight. Looking at our next question, question 2, we've got the yellow-throated scrub wren and the ground thrush. So here's our yellow-throated scrub wren, here is our ground thrush, and they inhabit the ground layer of the eucalypt forest because the ground thrush has a less specialized omnivorous diet to the yellow-throated scrub wren. Well, what does that mean? Well, by being omnivorous, it means it can eat both animal material like insects, but it can also eat plant material, and that is a big advantage because it hasn't locked itself in to the same food source as this yellow-throated scrub wren, which would result in a higher amount of competition if it did. So give yourself 1 mark for acknowledging the different food source. This means it can exploit a more diverse range of food. Give yourself 1 mark for that. And then another mark for linking that back to this, therefore avoids excessive competition for insects. And it means that that ground thrush and yellow-throated scrub wren, they can both exist in that area. One is not excluded or eliminated from that. And looking throughout all of this, you get this idea, even like the spine-tailed swift, it catches insects that fly to this higher layer compared to the flycatcher, which also catches it in flight. And you get that these birds are all able to exist in this eucalypt forest because they've divided up the different areas which they're going to be found. So divided it spatially, but also they've divided up their food source, or partitioned exactly what they're eating and how they're capturing that particular prey that they're getting. And that really clearly shows that the idea of resource partitioning and even character displacement, that certain beak sizes, for example, over time would have changed as well to suit the type of insects or food that they are feeding on. So one last question, guys, to finish off, to really drive home this idea. Using the data presented in Table 1, analyse how glider species have avoided competitive exclusion through ecological separation. Pause the video, this is worth 3 marks. See if you can add some data and answer this. Looking at this question, you can see that the sugar gliders, historically, well, they occupied the rainforest 70%, and in recent data, 64%. While the squirrel glider, it's in the rainforest 17%, and then recently 7%. So sugar gliders have clearly showed that higher occurrence in rainforest ecosystems, both historically and recently, compared to other ecosystems, where the squirrel glider, 83% of the time it's in other ecosystems, and 93% of the times it's in other, I shouldn't say ecosystems, or forest type, other forest types there. So conversely, the squirrel gliders showed a much lower occurrence in rainforests and significantly higher in other forest types, which may be, dry eucalypt forests and woodlands compared. And as a result, they've avoided that competitive exclusion simply because they are occupying different regions or different spaces within that particular ecosystem. So by dividing those resources up and partitioning the space, both of them are able to exist, and one has not been locally extinct from that particular ecosystem. This video should at least get you a good understanding of what a niche is. Make sure you know your definition, okay? That ecological niche is the role and space that an organism does fill in a given ecosystem, and it includes all of those abiotic and biotic interactions that that organism has. So think of the niche as the role, the profession, and also where it exists. You have also learned about the competitive exclusion principle, which 2 organisms that occupy the same niche cannot exist. So it'll either cause one to be excluded and therefore locally extinct, or those organisms that are competing with one another for the same niche will partition it. Okay, so that might mean that as a result they live in a different space, or they have changed some of their characteristics to feed on different organisms or different food sources that are available within that ecosystem. And the key ideas there, that you understand what a niche is, and that you can also understand that competitive exclusion principle and be able to really look at that data as well. That's an important thing. Use data in your answers, as you can see that we're doing throughout, and be able to support it with theory and evidence. Hopefully that's helped you guys understand that topic, and watch the next video for the last bit of functioning ecosystems.